I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group. Welcome to today's session on the current global shipping market, which has its challenges, as Adrian and Dan are going to be telling you. We're fortunate actually to have access and support from Adrian Blackman and Dan Williams, both of the Woodland Group. One Adrian based here in the US, in North America. Dan, I think you're in the UK, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
And they're going to offer a global perspective on what's currently happening in the market and perhaps some strategies to be able to cope with the uncertainty that governs international freight right now. So without spending any more time on that, Adrian, thank you. Dan, thank you. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate that this call may be joined by people around the US and possibly around the world. So I'm going to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, my name is Adrian Blackman. I am the Executive Vice President of Woodland Group located in the US. And I've been a member of the family, the Woodland family, for approaching 31 years now. I am joined by two of my colleagues, Dan Williams, who you've just met, and one of our directors, one of the directors of Woodland, who you'll also be hearing from later, along with Susie Scally, if she's with us, one of our business development executives. Woodland are relatively new members of BISG and proud members, I hasten to add. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Executive Director of BISG, Mr. Brian O'Leary, and the BISG family for extending this invitation to us to join today's Lunch and Learn. This is obviously with a view to discussing today's topic at hand, today's global shipping market. Hopefully, you all have your sandwiches and salads ready to roll, and should you ever feel inclined to doze off, that may be a good time to take another bite or maybe another large gulp of your beverage of choice. For those who may be unaware of Woodland, allow me to very quickly and provide a very quick minute overview so that it makes a little more sense why we're here. And now may be a good time to take that bite. Woodland Group embarked upon its journey 35 years ago with a vision of becoming a formidable global logistics provider, offering a sustainable supply chain solution. For the past 30 years, one of the several key focuses of the business has been working with the printing and publishing world, where we established what we believed to be a void within the supply chain. This started the recruitment journey for professionals with expertise we felt could help us make a difference. Fast forward 3.5 decades later, we are very pleased and proud of the suite of services Woodland offers. Services include, however, not limited to global transportation, import and export services via air and sea freight, air sea options, road and rail freight, warehousing, storage, fulfillment, and consultancy, specific for the distribution of books, Bibles, journals, periodicals, comics, magazines, and the like. Our commitment to digital solutions means managing and monitoring all shipments, which I will say has never been easier, whilst using our online platform, enabling an end-to-end tracking of orders, even down to an ISBN level. As we have found our way out of COVID, our industry has started to once again enjoy some sense of normalcy. With that said, I guess we could argue, what does normal even mean anymore, right? No sooner do we begin to appreciate that normal again, and I say normal, today's global shipping market was once again rocked and found itself faced with a number of new challenges, much of which a result of the recent conflicts unfolding in the Middle East. We would like to spend the short time we have this afternoon to delve into this a little further, in the hopes of shedding greater light on the current state of affairs. We'd like to talk about what we are currently experiencing and possibly what we can expect in the immediate and the near future. We understand today's forum allows for an interactive discussion, so I do believe it may be acceptable to either ask questions as we go, and Brian can validate that, and or prepare questions for a Q&A session towards the end. We will obviously do our very best to provide answers, and of course, for any questions we're unable to answer immediately, we will take notes ourselves with a view to researching further and reverting at a later date. We will introduce a few slides to help illustrate some of these discussion points. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Dan Williams, one of the directors of Woodland, who will at this time take us into our presentation. Dan, if you may, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Aid. Hello, everyone. Yeah, as I just touched upon, I'll just briefly go over exactly what it is and sort of the basic outline and structure of today's initial presentation for this Lunch and Learn. So we're going to start with, I think it's right that we start and look back at what we had experienced in 2023, which sort of set the foundation for what we're seeing now in 2024. Now, we all heard a lot. We're all involved in 2023, so I won't dwell on it too much. We'll then look at what's happening right now. So what are we experiencing right now in supply chain? What are the challenges that we're facing? And certainly we're hearing from our customers, such as yourselves. And then look a little bit more ahead to what this may mean for the future and the potential possibilities and impact that it could have on the supply chain going forward. This will be an overview across the entirety of global supply chain, but really trying to focus on the areas that are most specific to our industry, a book publishing industry. And due to it being the most volatile and commonly used mode of transport within the industry, I do talk a lot about ocean freight, but I will touch on air freight and obviously the domestic impacts as well within the US, Europe, and Asia. And then lastly, what I'll try to do, if not during the presentation, is make sure that we're all able collectively to summarize. That's great. That's what's going on in the supply chain, but what does that mean for us within the print and publishing industry? So what I'd like to achieve come the end of this for you is to be able to all of us to better understand and be able to forecast as best possible landing costs.
So how do I resolve that? So how does...
And also be able to give the best possible chance for us to be able to meet release dates, distributor deadlines, and obviously avoid those penalties and delays that can happen certainly in today's supply chain environment. So I will start by saying these are our thoughts, our predictions, or my predictions. Hopefully you find them useful, but I'm incredibly interested to hear exactly what you guys are experiencing and what challenges you're facing that we may be able to help with going forward. So what I've tried to do here, again, on the initial sort of set off, is look back at what we have experienced. And I touched upon at the beginning of this presentation, he used the word normal. Now, I don't know what normal is. None of us know what normal is, but the phrase is used an awful lot about, oh, had we in 2023 returned to normality? And that was on air, ocean, and domestic transport, given the craziness that was experienced around 2019 to 2022. Now, there is an element, certainly, of normality to what we experienced throughout 2023. I mean, largely around freight rates. You can see on the bottom right-hand side of this screen here, I just felt this quite a useful depiction of the impacts into Europe and the US as far as rate goes around what we would call sort of critical geopolitical or economic events. So COVID-19 pandemic, when the controls were lifted, and then since then, and we'll touch on this in a lot more detail a little further on, the attacks in the Red Sea and the immediate almost impact that they've had on rates to the US and into Europe out of Asia. Now, freight rates are largely impacted by one thing, and there are then you've got the subsection of impacts on freight rate. The main effect on freight rate is always going to be around capacity. So when there's available capacity and reduced demand in the market, the freight rate will drop. Some of the other effects that I've mentioned here as well along geopolitical and economical impacts would be people are making decisions or reconsidering their typical supply lanes due to risk on volatility of pricing. So obviously you can see again on that graph on the bottom right hand corner, the volatility on pricing specifically around China made people reconsider whether or not they're going to be working potentially as much on that trade lane or look to work as well on other lanes into, say, the US or Europe. Pressures such as sustainability. So there's pressures not only from that we put on ourselves, but that our customers will put on us, or even our distributors or suppliers. So using Amazon as an example on pressuring local supply and potentially nearshoring as opposed to being able to move freight long distances to fulfill local markets. You've got other geopolitical pressures such as increased duties into the US on China origin goods. Again, all of these things have played a part in demand on certain lanes, reducing or increasing, and ultimately then rate. What we have also seen as well, and I've mentioned on the bottom right bullet point, there is a rebalancing in US ports. So over the course of 2023, especially with the agreement being reached between the ILWU and the US government on with the unions, we saw a lot of volume move away from the US West Coast back to the US East Coast to avoid any potential strike action. Now, when the agreement was reached back in 2023, we've started to see a steady shift back, market share return back into the US West Coast from the US East Coast, which impacted normalized rates a little more in 2023 across all parts of the USA by ocean. So coming off the back of increased consumer spending and therefore increased demand and reduced capacity, we're now in a position where throughout 2023, we saw a reduction in consumer spending and therefore an increase in capacity. The big headache for carriers now, the really big headache for carriers that we're seeing now and certainly into the next few years is going to be that they had spent an awful lot and invested an awful lot in increasing capacity quite considerably globally. So with an estimated 7.2 million TEUs of additional capacity having been ordered between 2021 and 2023, with only 1 million of that arriving in 2023 and around 120 plus new vessels entering the market. And that's on the back of reduced demand, which is why we saw what we saw in 2023 with rates dropping quite significantly. So how are the carriers trying to react and manage capacity? Now, what we did see in 2023, obviously, is the rates fall as it became more competitive and their priority was to be able to fill the vessels that they did have moving. They looked to stem the bleeding. So you've seen or may have experienced a lot of blank sailings. They also completely cut off certain loops into the US, Europe, China, to again reduce the available capacity on the water. And they've moved vessels to other lanes. So whereby they had significant capacity on Trans-Pacific, China to US, or China to Europe, they took the decision to move some vessels completely onto lanes such as the transatlantic and even intra-Asia. And what this does is then impact those lanes with historically quite stable and steady rates. You're starting to see rates reduce as capacity gets increased on lanes that didn't necessarily need the additional capacity. Or you'll see rates on more volatile lanes flatline because they've got capacity even during peak. Air freight, much the same. 2023, we saw capacity return to the market as more passenger aircraft and more people started flying again. Obviously, a lot of books or a vast majority of books are moving on passenger aircraft and not freighter aircraft. So we're seeing that specifically impact the media industry. Rates remain stable across air freight throughout the whole of 2023 on most markets. And we expect on some localized areas, they are going to be impacted by the issues on the Red Sea. We also saw in 2023, domestic transport became much more available, rates fell, and have since really flatlined. Again, all about supply and demand. We're seeing a lot of, or many new or asset-heavy truckers across the US, unfortunately, be consolidated, acquired, or go out of business. And the likes of FedEx and UPS have been incredibly aggressive at the moment on parcel rates in order to try and take what is essentially a reduced e-com market, again, all down to consumer spending reductions. What is interesting to note, however, amongst all this doom and gloom around capacity and demand, is that demand actually remains around the same levels as it was back in 2019 and prior. So the issue isn't so much a significant fall off in demand against pre-COVID. It's the fact that there is so much additional capacity now in play that the carriers are having to take quite extreme measures to be able to manage that and keep the rates at what they seem to be as healthy levels. So that leads me on to the future. Any questions on that so far, or should we leave them to the end? Brian, I'm not sure what you'd prefer.
I think you can continue. We're going to be collecting questions as we go.
Okay, thank you. So, again, I've just tried to summarize in 6 very, very simple bullet points about what I'm seeing in early 2024, and what I perceive to be some of the sort of the major factors that will impact supply chain going forward as well. So we start with trade route disruption. It wouldn't be a February 2024 supply chain conversation without mentioning the Red Sea. So I felt this was just quite a useful image to be able to show exactly how much capacity going into Europe out of Asia and US out of Asia has been diverted away from the Red Sea and into the Cape of Good Hope. So you'll see here that you can barely see the blue, which indicates the prior to the Red Sea issues, the amount of volume moving globally via the Cape of Good Hope. And you can then see in January, you've got the best part of 60% and now more of that volume going over the Cape of Good Hope as opposed to via the Red Sea. So what the impact that is having, the impacts that is having on supply chains is increased transit times. It obviously takes longer to go around the Cape of Good Hope than it does through the Red Sea. That in turn is having an impact on freight costs. And it has meant the introduction of additional surcharges from carriers. We can't forget the Panama Canal. Obviously, that's another look. Before the Red Sea issues, we had some difficulty with the Panama Canal. There is reduced sailings through the Panama Canal, which again introduced surcharges, continues to increase transit time, but isn't impacting container ships in the same way as certainly the Red Sea has. But again, I'd be interested to hear from you at the end of this presentation as to exactly how it's impacting things like front list and back list orders and order patterns, as well as transit times and lead times that you've built into your existing supply chains. We've also got here environmental considerations in 2024. So carriers and airlines are looking at cleaner options. Unfortunately, that does on occasion mean, certainly when it comes to ocean freight, slower steaming. So again, increased transit times. Shippers are putting more and more pressure on vendors, ourselves, suppliers, to make decisions that are going to reduce their carbon footprint, and also then provide the backup data around carbon reporting and sustainability reporting. So we're being asked more than ever now what we're doing for our customers, and to be able to provide that information as part of sustainability reports. And we've also now achieved EcoVadis Gold accreditation for supply chain for the work that we're doing to minimize our carbon impact and then be able to pass that on to our customers. I've got cost pressures on here really impacting supply chain going into 2024 and beyond freight rates. So we're seeing not only volatility in cost of labor, and that is increasing. We're seeing businesses having to spend more money on cybersecurity, environmental initiatives, and digitalization as well. And the cost of insurance as a result of climate change events, extreme weather, etc., is also putting a significant additional cost to run a business, alongside obviously volatile freight rates. As a result of increased freight rates, we are seeing some decisions being made with I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later on friendshoring or nearshoring. So reviewing exactly where we're sourcing material from within the media and print and publishing industry, as opposed to what would be the more sort of historic or generic trade lanes that print and publishing would move on. Air freight capacity, and I said I'd touch on air occasionally on here. Air freight capacity in 2024, we have seen a significant increase again due to passenger aircraft being around 13% of additional capacity has been added into the market in January of 2024 versus January of 2023, which is why rates have remained stable, if not softened, on most major lanes this month. We are seeing some isolated spikes in parts of the Middle East due to, and I touched upon earlier, the sea air options. Now many are looking away from ocean freight due to the increased transit times. We are seeing some of our customers in print and publishing looking to sea air for some of the urgent front list orders. So and that would be moving freight from, say, main China, main Asia ports to the likes of Dubai via ocean, which can take anywhere around 7 days, and then air freighting that into the US or Europe from there on in to enable them to meet lead times. The fact that more freight is moving through Dubai via air into US and Europe has meant that the rates have increased. Again, going all back to supply and demand, the rates have increased ever so slightly on that lane, whilst many, many other lanes globally have remained relatively stable. One big consideration around infrastructure, and I've got at the bottom there, supply chain infrastructure, would be the US East Coast Union contracts is up for renewal again in October of 2024, so this year. So a lot of large BCOs and some of our customers are already having conversations with us about what would they do if strike action were to happen within the US East Coast. Remember, we went through it again fairly recently on the US West Coast. That is coming down the track, and it will be with us sooner than we can imagine. So there are some customers and certainly some BCOs already trialing shipping via the West Coast and land bridging across to the East Coast, as opposed to shipping into the West Coast. So they're prepared should the worst happen upon the contract negotiations in October. Now, technology here has got its own slide, because I know how important it is to everybody in supply chain at the moment. And what we're seeing very briefly is people have moved away from just in time and continue to move away from just in time, and are as they're able to make quick decisions and forecast on volumes far, far sooner. We're using business analytics, for example, to enable us to find optimal routing. So where there are uncertain void sailings, blank sailings, slow steaming, what's published by some of the ocean carriers or the airlines isn't necessarily what's delivered. So we're using the likes of AI, tracking, tracing to be able to better provide routing options to our customers to enable them to hit their lead times and distribution dates. Customs authorities are using technology and business analysis and data analysis, for being able to information share more effectively. So the sanctions lists are getting longer around the world now, but the governments such as the US, Canada, Europe, Australia and New Zealand are sharing more data than ever on export and import enforcement to enable the smooth flow of goods around all the sanctions, again using data. We've got the EU implementing one customs system, again, which will help transit of goods across the EU. And we're seeing incentives now for sustainability using the information and data shared. And the US, we're actually part of the US Green CBP Green Trade Program to help to discuss how businesses can be incentivized to think about sustainability in global trade. And the SEC as well are looking at potential rule changes to have businesses include climate-related information in company financial statements. And then you'll be pleased to hear, very lastly, this is the part where we try to summarize everything we touched on there, how that may impact us in the print and publishing industry. So starting with trade lane and shifting trade routes. So what we're seeing is more and more certainly more and more print options pop up and market share move to the likes of Europe from China. That's to diversify the supply chain. So we are very, very aware, or we certainly hear from a lot of our customers in relation to there's still a distance to go as far as quality. But we are seeing more volume move from alternative markets to China in print and publishing into the likes of the EU and the US. Again, I touch on friendshoring, and I mentioned that I'd come back to it earlier. Friendshoring is a term that I've come across that's been used to describe where countries work together that have similar beliefs, or where there's more comfort in the fact there might be less political unrest between two nations that would impact supply chain. So it's building in that extra layer of risk management to diversifying a supply chain. We're looking at contracts and pricing as well. So there are a number of different ways, and there's no right or wrong way, and there is no way for anybody to be able to forecast exactly what's going to happen around pricing. But it's all market dependent. But it could be worth considering, and certainly some customers are considering splits between longer term contracts and short term spot or FAK contracts on ocean freight. The benefit being that on a spot price or FAK price, you're moving with the market immediately, obviously, but the longer term obviously gives you a little bit more of an ability to forecast. There are pros and cons for each, and I am expecting to see more premium and tiered rate sets from carriers, airlines and ocean carriers as they enact more blank sailings, essentially encouraging people to pay more to guarantee that freight is going to move. I expect carriers are going to look to go down that road as they continue to reduce capacity. We haven't seen it so much yet. It exists, but it's not prevalent in the market. But I do anticipate that we're going to see more of that in the months ahead, certainly after Chinese New Year. And lastly, I've got consolidation on here. Consolidation, now what we are seeing, and I've got a very, very simple diagram here of one example of the way that we're seeing, certainly within the media industry, consolidation through publishers and booksellers and printers, etc., to try and reduce not only carbon footprint, cost, and also transit time. So here's an example of one of the consolidation routes: multiple printers in Europe, as opposed to sending from individual print locations to one destination. And again, it can work from the US by air or ocean, from Europe, from China, trying to consolidate goods, moving them via one central hub and spoke system to try and avoid as much delay as humanly possible, whilst reducing cost and carbon footprint. So we are seeing more of this hub and spoke in the industry, and we expect that to continue as well. And again, it's something that we've worked quite heavily on over the last few years. So in summary, the bottom line for being able to navigate all of these challenges going forward in the supply chain is going to be resiliency. I have no sort of antidote, but it is increasingly important that people do build resiliency in their supply chains to keep them flowing and meet deadlines. So if and when inevitably disruption occurs, a diverse supply chain with multiple routing options and multiple options is going to be the best way to be able to navigate these challenges. Thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate, I hope that's been helpful for you. And again, I look forward to a conversation.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Adrian, for doing that. If you want to stop sharing, and we'll have a chance to see more folks on the screen when you do.
No problem.
We've got a few questions in the queue, but I wanted to ask one. You talked about TEUs, and for folks who may not live in the freight universe,
Yeah.
just to explain what that is and why it's a useful measure for you.
My apologies. Yes. So a TEU is a 20 equivalent unit. So it's a measure, essentially it's half of a 40-foot container. So it's the measure that is used in the industry to be able to gauge volume movement across the world by ocean freight predominantly.
I mean, effectively, we
Great.
have a TEU, which is a 20-foot equivalent unit, 20-foot container. And there's also an FEU, which is the same, a 40-foot equivalent unit.
And did I understand, I think, Dan, correctly, that the overall volume demand essentially is relatively flat or comparable to pre-pandemic levels?
Correct.
Over
Yes.
the period of time, what's changed is capacity.
Yeah, so it's consumer demand. It's all driven by consumer demand. People haven't got as much money in their pockets. People aren't holding as much inventory through fear and significant delays in supply chain as they were through COVID. So I will say for the US, which is different to, say, Europe, the US is marginally up on demand and TEU volume moving into the US on pre-COVID, whereas Europe and other large nations like that are actually slightly down, if not flatlined.
One question we had from Ed midway through your presentation, Dan, asking, are shippers reallocating resources from Trans-Pacific to other routes to improve ship times compare with the Southern Capes? I guess maybe the broader question is, what's the impact of losing the Suez Canal for capacity?
For capacity, there's more capacity on the water. That's a very good question, whoever asked that. Thank you. There's a lot more capacity in transit as a result of the extended transit time. So, for example, transit time going around the Cape of Good Hope versus through the Red Sea has been increased by anywhere between, say, 7 and 14 days on average. That means the capacity still exists on that trade lane. Let's take sort of Asia US as an example. The capacity is still largely there, but a decent chunk of that capacity is in transit for much longer than it would typically be. So the net effect of that is that it feels as though there is less capacity at origin. It feels as though there's less equipment at origin, but that's because it takes months for supply chains as big as, say, the Asia US or Asia Europe trade to be able to adapt to some of the problems and increase transit times across the board by a week and up to 2 weeks.
I think we're going to see a greater reality check post Chinese New Year. So in the latter 2 or 3 weeks, there's been a bit of a surge of volume to get out of China on as far as the Trans-Pacific is concerned, as we know that the Chinese Lunar New Year is fast approaching. So there has been a bit of an uptick and a surge to get products out of China prior to that vacation time. I think as we come out of Chinese New Year, we will start to see what the real flow and the volume will look like, I think, for the foreseeable.
And I think in a related way, John's asking, have shipping times for containers, are they factoring out, I guess, the Suez Canal and perhaps the Panama Canal? Are they similar to what you were seeing with pre-pandemic levels across the Atlantic?
The transit times on the water?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Panama Canal, there are some delays in the Panama Canal. I think that it's been happening behind the scenes almost for so long now on container shipping. If you're moving bulk tankers and things like this, then you're going to feel the impacts quite considerably of the Panama Canal in recent months. However, for containerized freight, you're looking at anywhere. I think the average at the moment is around 7 days a delay to get through the Panama Canal for container ships, which in today's supply chain, I feel, or what I'm hearing from a lot of our customers, is that's something that they've almost become used to having to absorb. So it's not been felt in the same way as perhaps it would have been back in 2019 and prior.
And I think Lynn's asking this question. You alluded to it in your remarks, Dan, but the Panama Canal is being affected by a drought that is limiting the water levels, and therefore is it both the size and the speed with which ships can come through?
Yeah.
Yes, it will. It's largely weight related, which is why the bulk sort of liquid tankers are those most effective. It is reducing some capacity with the carriers. They're having to be a lot more mindful about what they load onto their vessels that will pass through the Panama Canal, even on containerized freight. My biggest concern going forward with the Panama Canal is that even when the drought subsides, the vessels, the additional millions of TEU or containers of capacity that the carriers have ordered in as far as new vessels and new equipment being containers themselves, is globally, including the Panama Canal, there are a number of ports and even terminals within some of the larger ports in the US, New York, LA, that are not able to handle some of these super vessels. And I don't think that the likes of the Panama Canal are going to be unaffected by some of these larger vessels, even if and when the water levels get back to where they were pre-drought. So I think it's going to be a problem across the world is port infrastructure for these new vessels. I think that will add additional lead time at port terminals, whilst the limited number of terminals able to take these larger vessels are going to be stacked up with these larger vessels waiting to unload.
And of course, there
Yeah,
are greater issues, right, with the Panama Canal, in as much as we're dealing with a nation of approximately 4 million people, of which half of the water supply in Panama is for personal use. It's drinking water, it's washing, laundry, and all the rest of it. So whilst the Panamanians are working on bringing in, I think, something like 760 million tons of water or gallons of water, that's really to support the people. Any surplus is then looking to be used to fill the Panama. So I think it's going to be a while before we see the Panama back from whence it came anytime soon. But there'll certainly be smaller ships.
And we quite closely monitor transit time, actual real transit times, certainly using maritime AI as opposed to shipping schedules and carrier schedules. I'd mentioned as part of that presentation there that we sort of look to optimize routings, and that and at the end of it, I'd said about having sort of dynamic supply chains where we're able to make very quick decisions is going to be increasingly more important, and that applies to routing options, whether it be over the US Canadian ports, the US West Coast ports, Gulf Coast ports, Panama Canal, East Coast ports. The ability for us to be able to pivot very, very quickly with the volumes that we move all over the world, whether it be transatlantic or Asia, US, Trans-Pacific, is going to become very, very important in supply chain. And the data that just comes from one source, such as a shipping line, isn't quick enough. So that's why we've invested quite heavily in using analytics and in some extent AI to be able to make very, very quick decisions. And we're going to see the carriers doing that as well. The carriers are all doing that. That's why they've been historically incredibly slow to react. Whereas what they've learned through COVID, what they've learned through the Red Sea, what they've learned through the Panama Canal is to be a lot more reactive. And they are using technology to enable them to do that as well, certainly with capacity management and route optimization themselves.
Right. I mean, it's an ecosystem observation. We had Jason Farrell, who's our board member of BISG, but also works at the University of Toronto Press in their distribution side, and talked about the historic underinvestment in infrastructure in North America. He gave some good Canadian examples as well as US examples, and just said essentially that it's not just a function of how quickly can you move it across the ocean, but how quickly can you process it through a port? And do you have the rail or truck infrastructure locally to then get it to its desired destination?
And you're absolutely right, Brian. Where we had during the pandemic, where we had a mass influx of volume coming, especially on the Trans-Pacific into the US, heavily into the US West Coast. Whilst we were putting on bigger ships out of China to get into the US, I think somebody forgot that we hadn't increased our volume of rail. We had the same roads and the same infrastructure. Right. And then we wonder why there's congestion. Well, we've got twice the capacity coming in to move on the same rail, on the same rail cars, on the same road. And that's why it was costing us as US importers and buyers an absolute fortune in storage and demurrage and various other additional charges that we would not normally have paid because of the congestion that situation created. So he's absolutely right.
In a related sense, Ed was asking in the chat, as freight has been perhaps elongated on the ocean, the transit times are longer. Has that slower movement of freight on the water translated to faster movement out of the docks? I mean, are we able to get freight processed and onto rail cars, for example, more quickly as a result, or is it pretty much already at capacity?
I mean, yeah, it really is dependent on the terminal.
Yeah.
Right. So, and by that I don't mean just LA. I mean within the tens of terminals that sit within LA port, and it does move from one terminal to the next. What we are seeing certainly is nowhere near the same levels of delays from getting from vessels onto rail as we had been seeing in the last few years, and 2023 was probably a better example, or certainly a better example of how it could work. I think the rebalancing that I've mentioned of TEU, or volume, between the West Coast, Gulf Coast and East Coast, where the West Coast are beginning to see what they expect to see as far as market share out of in global trade, and the East Coast are now not sort of picking up the burden of the disruption on the West Coast. I think that has meant through 2023 at least that the older infrastructures that were in place in Canada, the US West Coast, and likewise the Eastern Gulf Coast, are fit for purpose as best they're going to be up to now. I think when you do see that imbalance, which we could well see with the East Coast contracts and what have you, that's when you get, or when people don't want to go through the Panama Canal and take that risk and start diverting to the West Coast, that's where you really start to see strain in specific coasts or specific terminals. And we have started to see that in the early part of 2024 on the West Coast as people start to avoid the Panama Canal and the Red Sea. They are moving more over land. So more containers are being terminated in LA, for example, and then either moved via truck to the East Coast, or moved via rail into the Midwest and even over to the East Coast to avoid the Panama Canal and the Red Sea. So that's when you start to see that imbalance, is when you start to see pressure on an infrastructure not really set up to be able to support that.
What we also found was, as the volumes picked up into the US West Coast, and namely the likes of the LA Long Beach terminals, and we had congestion and we had risks of strikes and what have you, specifically in LA, a lot of the carriers and buyers started to reroute their shipments into the Northwest, into the likes of Seattle, Vancouver, Prince Rupert. That's worked for quite some time. And now we're beginning to see some of the congestion issues that we were having in the likes of the LA ports, in the Northwest ports. So people are now looking to return back to LA just to get their products, their speed to market.
And this is kind of a current affairs issue, but Stephen's asking the question of, did things like the recent extreme weather, the atmospheric rivers on the West Coast, create significant issues in the shipping industry, either for getting ships into port or getting freight through ports?
It was more on the road, and we have an office on the West Coast in LA. The issues are more on land than they were at sea. I think some terminals were closed for maybe a day or two, which didn't impact operations too much as far as port operations, getting containers off vessels. However, getting the containers off of dock onto rail terminal or to final destination on the West Coast, we have seen a small impact as a result of the bad weather. But again, it all depends on the expected lead times from one person to the next, but not a huge impact. They're pretty quick to open up again.
Thanks. I mean, that again goes back to that observation that you've made, and Adrian has reinforced, that it's an ecosystem, that there are a lot of interconnected parts, and we need to be able to look at them globally.
And that's, you're absolutely right, Brian. In the ecosystem is the truckers as well. There's more capacity as far as trucking. So when terminals open again, there's truckers there waiting to pick containers up. Whereas what we've seen when there's been a shortage of truckers is any sort of chink in the armor or break in the chain was having a significantly larger impact later down the line, because there wasn't the supply there.
Right, exactly. This is kind of a shifting gears a little bit. Bill's asking a question, and if you have the perspective on it. Apparently, there's recently introduced legislation in the United States to increase the minimum liability insurance requirements for interstate carriers, for truckers, from $750,000 US to $5 million US. Do you have a perspective on that, on what it might have, what it might do with respect to capacity, et cetera?
I don't. That would be one of the points that Adrian had mentioned that we'll speak to our domestic team on, and we'll
Yeah.
absolutely get back to you,
The-
Bill,
the-
on that one.
Okay,
And the good,
thanks.
we actually have our own in-house individual that manages our entire insurance policies as well. A guy by the name of Steve Wood. So I think we would certainly reach out to Steve and be able to get back to you on that question. He'll have the answer on that.
Great. And I can put you in direct contact with Bill, that we know how to get a hold of Bill.
And this was for domestic, right? The domestic insurance.
Yeah,
It is
interstate.
domestic. Yeah, it's a new issue for me, but thank you for doing a little bit of work on that. A comparable question. This is really specific to Woodland. The broad question is, when you're optimizing routing, do you try to balance transit time and cost more or less equally, or do you look at transit time more important or less important in the algorithms? Or does that vary by the customer or the goods?
Completely varies by goods and customers. It's backlist. If we're aware it's backlist, and there's a little bit more flexibility on lead time, and there's thus more pressure on cost than lead time, then we'd look at it completely differently to, say, an urgent order, which is where we sort of went into the realms of sea air, where it becomes super urgent, not urgent enough to air freight it all the way from China, but cost is obviously a major factor there. We've even had, so to answer your question, we could look within a remit of I couldn't possibly pay more than this, but I would like to see what options are available for transit, or we can give you the full length and breadth of routing options, going into the tens, if not the hundreds of routing options that you can have to bring a container into the US. With the associated costs, we have a pricing tool that does all of that hard maths and routing optimization for you, and we'll give you a multitude of different options. We also, adding to cost and transit time, we also have customers that come to us and say, can you run a forecast on carbon footprint based on varying routing options? So we can also run comparisons against, if you paid slightly more per container, would it help to reduce carbon output per copy versus the existing route? So there's short answer is it is entirely dependent on what the customer asks us to look at.
And maybe I have one other question that came in during the course of your presentation. This is from Mark, talking about ocean freight as a potential carbon footprint contributor. And he's just wondering if, given that there's excess capacity in the industry, is this a period where there's been efforts to update or retrofit to become more sustainable?
Yeah. So a lot of the TEUs that have been mentioned are entering, a lot of the additional larger vessels that are coming in, they all are having to be to a certain specification. So all the new order books for vessels that have been placed will be much more environmentally friendly. You may recall what seems like an age ago, you started seeing charges such as low sulfur surcharges on carrier bills, and they were largely relating to retrofitting older vessels with ways to break down and utilize some lower sulfur, more environmentally friendly fuels. So carriers, in fairness to them, have been making efforts to be able to retrofit. Slow steaming is the simplest solution to that. You go slower, you burn less emissions. So they are certainly making changes to some of the old fleet, but the new fleet coming in are all, by comparison, super eco-friendly, even against the retrofitted older vessels.
And I think that you made a point in your remarks, Dan, that is the importance of integrated demand planning and forecasting. Mm-hmm. This is an area where BISG has been pretty active over the last, I'd say 2.5, 3 years. Mm-hmm. We had a presentation at our annual meeting last April, and we'll have continued discussions about it this coming meeting. And I think that planning should include considerations for sustainability. So when you say, if it's a slower vessel that has a reduced carbon footprint, that's got to be part of your calculation when you try to do some sort of integrated planning, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, the consolidation I touched on as well is a consideration for reducing carbon footprint as well. When you're planning, if you're planning to consolidate as opposed to ship on demand almost, obviously that has a a positive impact, if you like, on reducing carbon footprint because you're moving more at once. Not to mention cost of shipping as well.
Yeah, and we did a webinar. I think it feels like it's been a year, Adrian, with Woodland on that sustainability question for ocean freight and other sources. So
with
that's available on our YouTube channel.
With our main man, Sustainable Sam, Mr. Warren.
Right, exactly. So that's worth going back to. And when we do a follow-up email after this webinar with a link to this recording, we'll include a link to that so that folks have a chance, if you're interested in that topic, to pick up on some of the things that were said a year ago.
I mean, one thing that Dan touched on earlier, and I think a large chunk of this audience probably are looking into or thinking about, is sourcing to an alternative vendors outside of China. Obviously, we saw that really kick off during the pandemic because you just couldn't get anything out of China for a short while. So many folks didn't have a choice but to look at alternatives. And we've seen a number of our customers moving towards the likes of Eastern Europe, not even Western Europe, but Eastern Europe. And with that, with Eastern Europe becoming an option, one of the products that we have developed to facilitate that is actually consolidating in Eastern Europe. Again, reducing the carbon footprint rather than having one shipment from the Czech Republic, one shipment from Poland, one shipment from Hungary, one shipment from Romania. You would have all those shipments in Eastern Europe that go into a central location in Europe. And that product then all moves together to the USA, to its final destination. Much more cost effective from a freight standpoint. And if we're interested in reducing our carbon footprint, that's certainly the way to do it. As Dan
and what
mentioned,
we've heard as well from other members and customers is obviously you've got the tax the Trump tax, the additional duties to consider, or the savings there where applicable. Obviously not to all books and what have you, but where applicable. You've also got the saving in transatlantic transit times, and I saw a question on here in relation to transatlantic transit times. They have remained relatively stable, and they are 50% into the east coast of those in terms of timing, compared to those out of, say, main China ports into the US west coast even, and certainly east coast. There's a considerable transit time saving there as well. So, and typically transatlantic rates are less volatile than those out of Asia, so it just gives a little bit more consistency, which is one of the many reasons why we're seeing our customers move wherever possible into Europe, Eastern or Western Europe, for some of the print.
Well, believe it or not, we're at time, and it just seems like it flew by. Given the number of issues you put on the table and the fact that we may be looking at a labor action in the fall, I wouldn't be surprised if I call on you again to give us a sense of what the freight market looks like, even in the second half of this year. But I really appreciate you making the time today. I know it's early in the year for you, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but with as many different things going on within the two major canals, plus around the world, your insights, I think, have been really helpful. We'll get a recording out to everybody shortly, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next month.
And likewise, again,
really
thanks very much to you, Brian, and for the time for all that have spent the time with us. If there are any further questions, please direct them to BISG, who I'm sure will forward them on to us. We appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.